Let's further on the topic of, are we overpopulated or are we not? Well, one, you have to ask the question, what does it mean to be human? Like, what is a healthy human life? What is, you know, the bare minimum? We look at the idea now, which has taken thousands of years to provide necessities to people. Now, I'm under the understanding, I have the understanding that entertainment is a necessity for human life. If you look at, this is an old philosophical thought experiment of mine, which you got to be careful who you say this onto. Is I would use it for various things, and that is leaving a person in a room. What is the fundamental? And I would take it into, if we took somebody, no matter who they are, and you left them in a room with a guitar, and we say that they don't need food or anything like that, they don't necessarily need to sleep. It's just that they have a guitar. Would they design music theory exactly as music theory's been written all these years? Solely with an instrument provided. And that allegory goes into various instruments and all sorts of thought experiments and concepts. But what does it really mean to be human? As we are now, if you just take the bare minimum, and that is occupying space, because we exist. So if we look at overpopulation, what is the amount of people that we can have to where we can actually still maintain an acceptable human life and experience? It's up for debate. See, we all have a thesis that is independent and individually designed per person. And so, without going into all the other correlating paradoxes, I'm trying to just stick to an older topic here, because I deleted all of my original work and writings. Anyway, that, I mean, potentially what Earth can really sustain right now at this moment, our mass population is roughly 19 billion people. And that's based off of our food production and how we can convert our entire infrastructure to support 9 billion people. Or 19 billion, sorry. 19 billion people. I think 20 years ago it was projected that 9 billion people would be our epitome. Now, I'm not talking about, there's other various things that we can do to dramatically increase how many people can survive on Earth. I mean, if we just stuck them all in cubes and fed them, and and like reprocess their human waste, you could have a trillion people potentially, right? But we need, as humans now, one, entertainment is a need, it's a necessity. If you don't have any entertainment whatsoever, being left alone in this cube, what are you? You're left with your mind, and that's it. And so then they're just inputting other things that sustain what it means to be alive: food and water, and that's basically it. And they have done this to people. I didn't know this when I came up with the thought experiment, that people had genuinely been locked in fucking rooms, chained to a bed. This one girl was, and she was so screwed up, she would play around in her own feces, and it's really sick what they did. Another girl was chained to a chair for like 15 years or something, if I remember right. So my thought experiment, when you look at just the human as it is now, and you put them in a room like that, they can't speak language. Their brain basically just turns to mush. They become incoherent. They're all just, we are stimulus based to our environments is what it is. And that's kind of just where the thought experiment ultimately ends up, is just stimulus bias. And that's why, one reason why potentially we can't imagine anything that cannot be possible in this universe. What that means is though we have a lot of science fiction that is allegedly impossible, it's all still based around a plausibility of three-dimensional physics and, well, fourth-dimensional physics actually. And so, how many people? If we had 19 billion people, that's roughly 47 square feet per person to occupy. 47 square feet isn't bad for a single person. And as long as you don't have a lot of interests. If you're a musician, you need a lot more space. If you are an athlete, you need a lot more space. You have to work out, you need more space. If you want to study, if you want to make art, you can always work out and convert certain areas to do overlapping things. But me particularly as an artist, I need one little area for my art, one area for my music, because when I go into that area, it's someplace that my brain has become acquainted with. And so, depending on how loud you want to play music, right? How big that area needs to be. And you can play a guitar in a 3 or 4 square foot little cube, but you're never going to feel the freedom that music kind of requires. And so then you have all these little variables that, not just looking at, so if we take, that's 40 square foot, 47 square feet of land that is at ground level. It's our surface area of land mass. That would cover 19 billion people on Earth, right? And so obviously we need farmland, we need forests. A lot of it's over elevation, and some of it's too cold, a lot of it's too cold. And so that number shrinks dramatically. And this is all because Elon Musk says that we have an underpopulation problem. We are underpopulated. What would happen right now if we had 19 billion people? The flaws, the paradoxes of democracy start to come out to play, as they have throughout history. And I'm trying to stay away from all the other paradoxes that govern human freedom and free will, but that ignoring the ocean, obviously. I mean, let's say it goes back into what is acceptable human life. Do you want to? Some people like boats. They like houseboats. I hate the ocean. But if you just leave out the variables of personality, just to try and simplify the equation, because it's very complicated once you start. I mean, we don't even really have too many interests, do we? I mean, there aren't too many things to go out and do on a daily basis. There's cooking. One of my pleasures in entertainment is cooking. I'm a chef. Yes, various sports. Driving is big for me. And that's pretty much it. There isn't a whole lot. And so when you start living like that, where I'm locked up pretty much a majority of my time. I don't like going outside and pretending that people are a reason to exist, but I do recognize now that people kind of do make certain moments important. Put it that way, right? People can tend to make things worth experiencing, as long as you have somebody else who's worth experiencing something with. Well, a majority of people, put it this way, have been conditioned to pursue wealth and civil moral fiber. Social equity is what I just kind of dumb it down to. It's all just social equity. That they start defining themselves by what other people don't have to explain their value and their worth, and that it makes them right to have other people in this flawed democracy. As long as there's more people that can be perceptively right, it starts violating the laws of free will. But I didn't want to go into that, and why the greater good is often the lesser good. I'm kind of losing my train of thought here. Look at my painting while I make a drink. Can you see it? I love the painting. It's a little better. Oh, this is the wrong bubble. So yes, there definitely is, without waiting for people in that sense, flawed democracy to change, to reduce the complexity, essentially. Reduce the diversity is what it does. To simplify what it means to be a human life, that we can start reducing what it means to live a respectable human life. And right now, the main thing is work. People think that they're better simply because they work. Honestly, that's completely fucking false. And the reason is because once you take away that fundamental of work, like the pandemic did, people, you just saw a broad margin of their directions changing into social media. A lot of people, there were articles written at the time to explain like the struggles that people were having being together all the time rather than looking forward to being together. And Voltaire, maybe I could find it, the original Voltaire, about happiness is really cool, and I don't normally quote. I'm not going into my explanations of happiness. Maybe I could find it. Which one is it? This one? I rarely use these. They're just really cool books. I tried to find it again. So I have these. These are really old. He explains, this is something weird. The pages aren't cut. That's strange. This one is the dream of human life. It's just writings on happiness. I don't think I lost a book. I did. I think I had a book in an old car. I might have gotten lost. She never gonna find it again. See, happiness, what he described in his philosophical dictionary, it's this one. I should have really found this source. 15 minutes. HI. Yeah, okay. Should be in here. No? Heaven. Happy. Yeah, so is this one. Alright. So here's a 1901 print of, I only own, missing 2 or 3 of the dictionary. But, so, here we go. His philosophy is brilliant. So, what is called happiness is an abstract idea composed of various ideas of pleasure. For he who has but a moment of pleasure is not a happy man. In like manner, the moment of grief constitutes not a miserable one. Pleasure is more transient than happiness, and happiness than felicity. When a person says, I am happy at this moment, he abuses the word and only means I am pleased. When pleasure is continuous, he may then call himself happy. When this happiness lasts a little longer, it is a state of felicity, and we are sometimes very far from being happy in prosperity. Just as a surfeited, I think that's how I said that word, surfeited, invalid eats nothing of a great feast prepared for him. Just as a surfeited invalid, I don't know what that means. So, his point is that as it goes on, the writings of happiness without free will philosophy means that he wrote that you can't experience happiness too long, right? The ancient adage, no person should be called happy before his death, seems to turn on it very close. Where is it? Where he... Anyway. I derived that happiness is a niche emotion in free will philosophy. I wasn't going to try to get into the laws of free will, but it's kind of inherent when you're talking about what it means to be human, right? So, all that aside, he wrote about his time and what happiness basically meant back then. I wrote about happiness from my perspective, because I don't experience happiness. I experience moments of joy. So it's the same thing in how he remarks that he sees it only as pleasure until it's continuous. And I've never experienced a continuous, reliant source of what you would call pleasure to be happy. That is really strong. I put more soda in there than that. That was attractive. Oh my god. Anyway. So, before I got these books, I wrote about it. I think I got these in 2017, around there. And that's when I started comparing my work, my writings, my old writings. And I derived happiness as a niche emotion around our thesis of having infinite potential, and that our thesis is understanding, knowledge, and wisdom that explains everything we do in life. We try to understand scenarios, situations, what's happening, what we are. Because we have individuality, the knowledge of understanding becomes diversifiable. And that's kind of where religion and democracy start to envelop, and then the paradoxes form around that. And wisdom is the application. So wisdom becomes like our own sense of application, of understanding and biasing that with knowledge and how we apply it to real world, or the same thing, to using knowledge and biasing through understanding. And so that paradox that overlaps our thesis is that we can understand and we can know, but we act upon understanding. That's called wisdom, or we know through understanding. And that's more like religion. That's kind of what that is. And so fall asleep. So what do? How do you maintain if we have an underpopulation problem? Now, happiness becomes this niche emotion. You cannot occupy the same niche of happiness. One person, and you look at this population problem, you look at apartments and you look at the blocks, like I mentioned in the start of the video. So the blocks correlate to basically apartments, is what it is. And you take this to the grand margin, we all become like a Borg society, because, well, Borgs didn't have individual rooms. What am I saying? It's a bad example. Is that we either become colonialized, become colonial colonies, like ants, like an ant colony, or which is basically what we are now, because we only pride ourselves on work and disdain from people who don't necessarily work. But if you look at the fundamental of the human condition, you're completely false. You're not just better because you work. And then you look at the hive, which is a hive structure that is basically like living in an apartment building. If you consider happiness as a niche emotion, that one person wants to be on the top floor, only one person can live on the top floor, because now you have 47 square feet per person, right? So there might be somebody at the bottom that wants to live on the top floor, genuinely. They love views, right? A lot of people do like views. Well, the truth is, like hanging out on a mountain, people will just go up, these young girls, and they're in their little cliques, and they'll just take a photo and leave. I'll sit there for hours and just enjoy, because there's nothing else to do or live or enjoy. It becomes a social equity, where then living at the top, you value that because somebody else wants it. And that's a huge issue, and why, and how you start to derive the laws of free will, where when I wrote them as a paradox so that they couldn't be corruptible. The problem is that you cannot reword these in any fundamental way. As long as they have the exact same structure linguistically, they are non-corruptible. Because in my structures of philosophy, I worked so hard to weed out my personal afflictions and derive the fundamentals of free will, and that free will shall always be preserved. one should never assume that they can preserve free will. Thus is the value of knowledge, understanding, and wisdom. And so when you look at what that means, free will should always be preserved. It means that you can't define what it is. It's only outlineable around the theory of, what philosophy is defined as everything and nothing. So as long as free will is preserved, that means that people are considering what free will is. So you take an unsolvable question and you give it an unsolvable answer. As soon as you, the way I would put it is I am, right? So the moment I said that I am was the moment I had that epiphany. Like, it's a really interesting feeling when you get this. And what comes after is your knowledge or your understanding or your wisdom. I am whatever else. But the fundamental of what man is simply I am. And some other philosophers say, I think, therefore I am. That's another great way of putting it. And that tacks on to that point that we are biased by our own brain, that we are man, but also, since we can think, we have an infinite potential of diversity cognitively. And so when you look at the second law, that one should never assume that they can preserve free will, such as the value of understanding, knowledge, and wisdom, that applies the application of your own consideration and your knowledge. And so these two little paradoxes that work together create this law of free will that is undefinable and yet inspiring in thought. And that's perfect philosophy. And I've worked, I don't know how many years now, to try and prove them wrong. And you can always rewrite them, but then you corrupt them. Every single time you change them, any way that you change those two phrases whatsoever, they become corrupted. And you start limiting free will. And so once you start to study how you can corrupt the laws, you start to realize that those corruptions are made around the paradoxes of choice, the bias of choice. And when I wrote my little I haven't even finished it, but I wrote basically a constitution of philosophy to govern all cognitive life in the universe. I was planning way ahead. Yeah, I mean, anyway, I'm just planning way too far ahead, right? So that free will. Oh, I did miss the first law. So I guess maybe there's three. I'm a little tipsy, right? That the free will. That's it. That's the first law. Silly boat. Free will. See, I know nobody to talk about this stuff with, so it's just like stuck up here until it falls apart. Yeah, free will can neither be given nor taken. Such is the value of something. What was my quote? I can't even quote my own self anymore. Free will can neither be given nor taken, for then it's not free will, right? So, but free will should always be preserved, such is the value of understanding, knowledge, and wisdom. There you go. There's so much crap in my brain, dude. Man, that's why I drink so much. I'm so afraid that because I know that if you really do provide something so great, it can be the greatest weapon. I never figured out how to turn it into a weapon, other than the fact of other issues in society, that the option to, say, pull the trigger on somebody means that your offspring will have that same conclusion in their brain, but their scenario, their life is all entirely different, and they could become a criminal just as much as you became a hero. Much better. Where was I? Yeah. Free will can neither be given nor taken. That means is that it's a law that I designed to prevent hypocrisy. Hypocrisy, at the fundamental, is our greatest weakness. It's ridiculous how much there is to consider when it comes to hypocrisy, because it is behind every choice that we make. And we're getting into paradox democracy now, or paradox philosophy, and how behind every choice is a paradox. Thus, hypocrisy consumes us all, because thanks to happiness being an niche emotion, one state of happiness in one of those paradoxes based on two people, as soon as you start incorporating a third person, you got yes or no, right? And so this person says yes, this person says no. As soon as you implement a third, they say yes or no, right? Unless they stay and sit inside the little paradox. Hypocrisy forms then, because happiness biased around a niche emotion where everybody makes the most selfish choice possible, which means that behind every choice, well, it's fucking selfish. We can literally not be selfish, is what it is. No matter what, every choice you make, it's always selfish. And you might think eventually, oh, that person was selfless. He jumped on a grenade and saved another man's life in a war. That a lot of the times that's kind of instinctual too, but you still made the choice. And that selfishness is in that you get to basically be a hero. So it's a positive form of selfishness, certainly, to some degree. But if that grenade was meant to kill somebody else, you don't know the entire, prospects of the future. You really don't have a clue what your choices are going to do. You might change that person and they become better, or, like everything else, derives down to fucking Hitler. What was the theory that every conversation be reduced to Hitler? But yeah, there was a soldier that let him live, right, in World War I, that could have shot him. And that paves that same way that you don't really know the future, but yet you are still impacting it. And we are all selfish. So, boy, I went way off topic. I don't know. I might end up dead. So, well, people doing stupid things every single day. The probability of me encountering such incompetence thoroughly every single day, most likely gonna end up dead soon. So I gotta get all this shit out before I can even write a book, right? And it's not shit, obviously, but so I am writing a book about it to explain. It's basically a philosophical constitution to govern all cognitive life in the universe, and it is not a reduction of the Constitution. It is an evolution and a progression of it. Because our Constitution, is the greatest philosophical work. People are always wanting to reduce it, and liberty affords freedom. Oppression limits freedom. So this video is really long. I don't know if I'm going to upload this. I'm sure I'm going to run out of battery space soon. Oh boy, where was I at? So we were at paradoxes and how happiness is it's actually a fucking weapon, kind of, in a way. And as long as you obey the laws of free will, then eventually the choices that you make formulate democracy. And that's where, at that little paradox between the two choices, yes or no, that third person is left with democracy. I mean, that's where it fundamentally starts. And so you have a bias of that selfishness, as I regard it, that hypocrisy consumes us all. But how do you democratically start making what would be considered a proper choice? It only really barrels down to that one extra decision. Otherwise, if you have four people potentially, then they could just reach an impasse, right? And haberdashery. Golly, golly. So, I shouldn't have deleted all that. I wanted to test myself. I took paradox philosophy into 7 dimensions of paradoxes, and that's where my personal limit was. And I found a flaw. And the flaw really started to show where corruption formulates in philosophy, like why Marxism becomes Marxism, and why Voltaire became, biased by a Catholic structure, and so I noticed that eventually, no matter what, and no matter how many dimensions of paradoxes you have, you cannot escape hypocrisy. It's always there because we make choices. And so the only option is a third option, which is living within a paradox. And living within the paradox means that perceptively we can ignore the value of the person living on the top of the building that values the top of the building because other people want it. As soon as you start looking at free will, the laws of free will like that free will is neither given nor taken, then you start to see what evil actually is, what justice actually is, or what injustice is, right? What crime is, and the difference. And I would always reduce that to, that, say the police, for instance, they break the same laws that they pretend to uphold. If you're speeding, they speed to catch you, and then they extort you. If you remove the cop, and you remove everybody else, okay? No, I'm not talking about an accident or anything, that's when the moment of justice needs to be occurred to try and return things to a prior moment before the choices were made outside the paradoxes. That as long as if you remove somebody from a scenario and nothing else is bad, nobody's benefiting from it, right? So if I'm pulled over and I'm not benefiting, that means that a crime has occurred upon me by violating the laws of free will. And I live by these laws. This is how I live. And so I don't believe in, a judicial system that extorts people. If you remove the people, we're there to provide freedoms, to provide liberties that we all agree on can be slightly modulated. That worked for a good few hundred years. But what about paradox democracy? Paradox democracy. That's a dangerous way to use that. What about paradox philosophy, right? So, because if you start calling it the flaws of paradox democracy and condemning democracy, well, it's not condemning democracy, but it's just looking at how to make it better. In that, the way I look at it now is that, to simplify it, if somebody wants to go fast, let them go fast, and they will let you go slow. And we try to create a structure where each person is allowed See, that's where the second dimension that comes in of the paradox, and that free will can either be given or taken. Maybe it can only be outlined, right? Once you start changing them, you ruin the laws. And so, don't change them. You can't change them. So, somebody going faster, right, for instance, will eventually encounter somebody going slower, because if somebody's going the fastest, everybody else is going slower. And if somebody's going the slowest, everybody else is going faster. Well, the way that democracy alleviates that is by majority. And so majority is right in between there until we find this little tiny focal point right in the middle, and the majority are free on the outside of those limitations. If that makes any sense. So say someone's going 100, 1 mile an hour, right? And those are the slowest, and those are the fastest. Those are the most criminal of the democratic structure that lives in between that. Once you then start weeding those out, you find a harmonious ground where everything's even. And then what? People start going into that because we agree, like that's the safest or whatever. After that collapses, and everybody's the same. So you either become a hive mind or you become colonialized, and or religious, God forbid, that everybody then on the outside is now the majority with as much choice and freedom as possible. So that's kind of how you use the solutions of the laws of free will and the paradoxes of free will and democracy. Anyway, see, it takes 40 minutes to describe this. And since I'm speaking from my brain, it's not as easy as writing it out, so then that's way easier, right? So what does that all mean for population, for how large a population can be? And are we literally going to accept people just because there's a lot? What is simpler than thinking? Wanting, right? The easiest stimulus that we have is to want. We should never define democracy by that, right? It needs to be defined by thought and self-awareness. And so you reach another, like a third stage paradox that starts overlapping all this other stuff. This is where the dimensions really start to formulate in how, because it's better to just reduce and derive. If you want to go fast, let somebody go fast. If you want to go slow, let somebody go slow, right? That we have these people that now define what is acceptable as a human race, and they form the majority share. And let's be honest, they're not very intelligent, but they're very innocent people. They don't think about this stuff. They go to work, they work a day, and we support that because that formulates society. Is what it does. It keeps things going. It gives you something to look forward to. It gives you an excuse to not like something. You hate work. It means everything outside of work becomes happy. It becomes joyful. Me? I'm miserable all the time. You put me in a working environment that I don't enjoy. There are very few jobs that I enjoy, but I'm so crazy that I will explode. I'll just fucking leave. I can't handle it. It makes me suicidal because my whole future has already been laid out for me. So I would rather just die now than waiting 60 years. Why wait 60 years to die, looking back and regretting my life? I mean, why is it that people lay on their deathbed resenting people for their choices? I don't understand that. But you look back, now, a majority of people, I assume, look back at those that don't have regrets, and they themselves have regrets, and understand the whole point of people like me, why I do matter. Though if you erase all of this intellectual capacity and we go back to another fundamental era, philosophers still have value in that they understand how to fabricate a future that is self-aware and that is cognitive. And it's not simply because I grew up on a farm that the idea was everybody should work. and and that's true to an extent until you get tractors. Once you get tractors, they're all laser guided too, man. The thing is that all you're really doing is building a stronger body. And so when you look at people that say, hey, we need to work harder, well, that's a completely false dichotomy. To think that you believe that better is working harder. And that goes into like intelligence and the need to better and the paradoxes of that. In that we could all hand plant something. You could have one guy go to a field, work really, really hard with a hoe, with a backhoe, and he's just gonna go plant the entire field. Now everybody then is dependent on this physical output of labor, because one person can only provide so much food. Since we don't have mass production, we don't have tractors anymore, anybody that's produced on the farm has to essentially start, supporting themselves. Self-sustainability is key at the end of this one. But the problem there is you're always going to have a child that has the potential of, infinite potential. They have infinite potential. They have infinite plausibility of any sort of diversity. You just start weeding those kids out, letting them starve to death, and all you're living is a farmer's life that you worked really hard, that was unnecessary, that the intelligence of what it means to be human, through these laws that I've been mentioning the last 40 fucking minutes, is that hypocrisy starts to formulate again, in how what is better and what is most better based on like the social equity, but you're going to start replicating everybody's lives. Everybody's doing the same thing, essentially. And that's one reason why it took so long. War really helped to afford that our entire philosophical infrastructure today. War has helped do that. And the reason is because otherwise we would all just be farmers replicating each other's lives and we wouldn't be human. Because today, what does it mean to be human? If you lost in your room, like that original allegory, right? It starts to develop into this entire philosophical infrastructure. That what does it really mean to be human? There's so much more that I can say, but I've been talking for 50 minutes. I don't want to keep talking anymore. It's good to brush up on it. But yeah, so simply working harder, what that affords you is a body that has been structured around working harder. My brain's been structured around thinking. I grew up on a farm. They did not make me work hard. I played out in the field. I played out in the forests. In the trees. I rode my bike in the country. I fought barking dogs that chased me as a child. My imagination was what I did. I played with my imagination. I fought entire armies and worlds and all this other stuff, and it's all I had, essentially. That was weird. I don't know why it's so off-putting today. In the long run, what did it do? Well, we're going to have a lot of children, right? So Elon Musk says that we are underpopulated. Luckily, I've been studying philosophy for the last 10 years, and I understand all these things. I'm a lot smarter when I write things out, because I'm just rambling now. I'm not actually considering as well as I do when I can sit down and write. But, yeah. Got to. I know I sound like a fucking weirdo. if we had, per se, just focused on being farmers, tilling the land and planting, and that's all we did. What if the farmer only has one son to replace him? Well, you would need like 2 families, right? And so after 2 generations, they become incestuous. That's another issue to consider that you have to think about. And I mean, life is so fucking special. It's so special. All life matters, but cognitive life is extraordinary. And so the farmer eventually will have one son that can't repeat what he did, or the farmer will work too hard and too well, and the son becomes weak from not working and eventually runs through his resources. And I suppose the mouse utopian experiments are really good for this sort of similar description. But the truth is, at that fundamental level, you weed yourself out, or you become incestuous. And we all know those issues. And so you're forced to reproduce to where at least you have, third generation cousins. You have to. And what that means is then they're compiling. So you have 3 kids. They each have 3 kids with somebody else. And then you need a third family. So then you have to start off with 6 or 9. This argument goes back to 555, 66, or 777, and how 666 is like the devil's number, 5 is the human number, I think, and 7 is the holy number. Now, I'm not religious, but when I get into this argument here, it starts to look at like that. So you need 3 families, each with 5 kids, 6 kids, or 7 kids. What happens to the future of the species as they start compiling and creating variables? How do the generations change? How is the influence of the grandfather, so the original, right, the foundation, the fundamental state of education, where the second generation then is inherently independent and wants to either replicate the life, can only replicate the life, to where then you have 4 other children, 5 or 6 other children. And what are they going to do? And so, having so many children, what happens throughout the infrastructure for loyalty, for desires, why do we keep collapsing over and over again, stuff like that, is all correlating to this inherent philosophy that we really fucking need, and we need it. So I don't know, I get it. So I took my opportunity. I was really naturally gifted with philosophy growing up. I didn't realize it. I just always liked it. But it just is natural to me. So I took my opportunity and tested myself thoroughly. And so what am I? I'm a philosopher for some reason. The most pointless of people, and yet the most needed and important in a way, so that you can create people that are naturally entwined into all of these little things. See, if it's natural to me, and if it were natural to everybody, true world peace should happen. Inherently, it should just form by itself. It should just form naturally, rather than violating the laws of free will. And what that means is when you violate the laws of free will, that free will can never be given or taken. You start to define free will by oppression, and you start to define peace by limiting freedoms and liberties, and oppressing people, and that just repeats the fucking process every single time. So. That's everything for now. Well, I haven't gotten to the 7 dimensions yet. They are. I found the 7th, and I was just like, right? Because you have to hold all this in your head, and then you start reducing all that stuff to those most fundamentals, and then the 7 dimensions start to become very interesting. But like I said, it was inherent that I was becoming my own fear and corruption. I don't want to be a modern Marxist. I want to be a true philosopher. I did really fucking good at it. I was really good at it. But you wanna know how I did it? I took a chair. There's a wooden chair with like a metal frame structure, and it's got this wooden thing at the bottom, and then that was bolted to a wooden ring, and I broke that, and I took 2 bolts, put them on opposite sides, and so the chair had it balanced on this wooden ring. I think I've mentioned this in another video. And so I sat there, and I would use that as one physical distraction. And I would play video games. As a kid, I would lay down, upside down. I would watch TV and listen to music. That was another way that I did this. I had like 3 stimuluses that, I don't know, it just allowed me to think clearly, is what it does. If I don't have 3, then my brain isn't free to wonder. Why? Why did I do this to myself? It's the only thing that makes me happy. Alcohol makes me happy. It's true. It's weird. Gonna die anyway. Fuck does it matter? So this whole thing I designed around into the true artist utopian society, right? Delved into physics. I mean, I wrote a gravitational field model. Though I will admit, what I've been thinking about today, last night, it dawned on me, why is there buoyancy in superfluid? Why does buoyancy happen in superfluids? Like, why can something float? Superfluid, it doesn't make any sense. It shouldn't float. It has 0 viscosity, right? You take a propeller, you spin it, it'll just, I mean, in regards of like friction, theoretically, I mean, you reduce the friction down to 0, same as 0 viscosity, it'll spin indefinitely. There's no resistance. So, in theory, I, that like, since superfluids are inactive by gravity, viscosity then is reduced to zero. Gravity then increases the momentum of the mass by the fluid, and so that's why they creep up and around containers. So why an object, any object, can float in a superfluid blows my mind. I'm like, I never realized this before. Well, superfluids are my favorite thing. It doesn't make any sense. I understand buoyancy as a negative mass to positive mass ratio. That for a positive mass to float by displacing water or a fluid, the negative mass in, say, like you have either a triangle or a boat, you draw a line across, right? You take all that mass and you create a perfect sphere, and you start displacing that mass with negative space. That the negative volume has to be essentially greater than the mass, the positive mass, by ratio. And that's all volumetric, and that's why buoyancy exists. That's how I understand it. But then I read that it's the mass of the fluid that is displaced has to be greater than the mass of the displacing body. I'm like, oh, it's like, they're right, but opposite of me. So, I mean, God, I was right? That's cool. I love being right in science, but then it gives me one less thing to think about. And then I'll get depressed again in a week. Because I'm going to be thinking about superfluids again, my favorite thing. There's always something interesting about superfluids. And, like, we can have zero viscosity. How can we have zero friction? We lower the temperature and get zero viscosity. Logically, wouldn't raising the temperature reduce friction? But things should just sink in a superfluid. Like they should. That's the way it should work. Everything should sink in a superfluid, but nothing. But you can float it. You have a boat that just. And if our oceans were superfluidic, which is really strange because you can't use a propeller in a superfluid, but you can float in it. And floating in it should generate waves, right? But yet a propeller can't generate waves because it can't move superfluids. It just like spins freely. It's the weirdest fucking thing. The water doesn't, the helium doesn't move. The liquid helium doesn't do anything. But if you're in a boat and you push yourself off from one side, does the water just stay smooth and just like, but yet you can float on it? But if I had a container of superfluid, I could shake it and create waves, right? I mean, it should move. What do waves move like in a superfluid then? Because it should just go like, it should just kind of stay flat. Like it's not actually going to have wave structures because there's no viscosity to create higher and lower pressure pockets, right? So it's just like instantly sort of thing. And yet, at the same time, a superfluid atom of helium, with any movement added to it, should go freely through the substance. They should all be doing that, but they don't. Superfluids are so cool. About an hour. I'm gonna turn this off.